just a diet. Being vegan is becoming a fashionable lifestyle, championed by animal and environmental rights groups, and seen as an effective way to lose weight. But is being vegan as good as it seems? Veganism is a strict diet without any animal products, so no meat, dairy, eggs, or even honey. Compared to other diets, vegan tends to have less saturated fat and cholesterol, and more dietary fibre. So vegans tend to be thinner, with a lower risk of heart disease. But a vegan diet is naturally lacking in some key nutrients, like calcium, omega-3, vitamin D, and vitamin B12. So vegans need to eat fortified grains or take supplements. Being vegan has long been touted as the best way to reduce a person's carbon footprint. According to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, the animal agriculture sector is responsible for around 15% of human-induced greenhouse gas emissions globally. And the world's demand for livestock products could increase by 70% by 2050. In 2010, a UN report said that a global shift towards a vegan diet is vital to save the world from hunger and reduce the worst impacts of climate change. But not all scientists agree, and recent research challenges this long-standing idea, pointing out that this isn't a case of comparing apples with apples, and that the data on the environmental effects of food supply, from the farm to the table, is extremely complicated and potentially misleading to measure. So is going vegan really the best diet for our health and the health of our planet? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from New York is Neil Zacharias. He's the co-founder and editor-in-chief of One Green Planet, which is a digital media platform in the food sustainability and green space. And from Cape Cod, Massachusetts, I'm joined by Tamar Haspel. She writes about food and science for the Washington Post. Both of you, thank you very much for joining us. Tamar Haspel, let's start with you. I went to PETA's website. Now, understandably, and excuse the pun, they have a dog in this fight. They cite an Oxford University study published in the journal Climatic Change, which shows that meat eaters are responsible for almost twice as many dietary greenhouse gas emissions per day as vegetarians, and about 2.5 times as many as vegans. That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think that if we look at two choices, choice A being what we eat now, particularly in the United States, and choice B being a vegan diet is clearly better for the environment. The question is, if you try and drill down and take a more granular look at the options, can we include meat in a planet-friendly diet? And I think the answer is unequivocally yes.
Can we include meat in a planet-friendly diet? And the answer is yes. Neil Zacharias, I'm guessing you're going to disagree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think firstly we have to think about how we farm today. We don't have farms. To even call it farms is a misnomer. The problem we're really facing is we are taking animals and putting them in these factories, keeping them largely indoors, and as a result of that, the way we produce meat is resulting in more greenhouse gas emissions than even the transportation sector. To answer your question, I think what the world needs is for folks to start to move towards more plant-based foods in their diet and meat reduction as a starting point. I don't even think the whole world needs to go vegan. I think we largely need to shift towards a diet that is reduces the amount of meat and dairy that we consume and includes more plant-based foods in it.
Neil, you sound as if your argument is not necessarily against meat eating per se, but you're mainly against the farming model. Am I misrepresenting you by saying that?
That's correct. And I think you have to look at the way we farm today versus how we did in the beginning. In fact, the farming is not really the problem. The problem became that we decided to turn our farms into factories. And as a result of which, now you have animal agriculture as the heart of our environmental crisis. In addition to greenhouse gas emissions, it's also causing air and water pollution, land degradation, deforestation. So the downstream impacts of this industry is the thing we need to keep in mind. And we're 7 million people on the planet today, and the way we produce meat requires us to degrade the land and water and our climate at a global scale. We'll be 9 billion by 2050. The real question is, how do we continue to feed this growing appetite for meat without pushing our natural resources to the brink? And I think we've come too far down the line to rely on this model to completely reinvent it without considering some alternatives. And I think the alternatives is shifting towards plant-based foods or incorporating more vegan meals within your daily diet.
Tamara Haspel, in an Orwellian sense, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others, I guess. I'm looking at cattle. And I guess, is there agreement that cows are probably the worst when it comes to this, and that there are other meats that are lower along the scale that are safer for the environment?
Unfortunately, the answer to any question you ever ask about farming and agriculture is it depends. And I think Neil is correct that the factory farming model that we have developed here in the United States is problematic in all kinds of ways, environmental and, of course, from an animal welfare standpoint as well. And your question about cattle also sort of depends on how those animals are raised. Certainly, cattle are problematic because they're ruminants, and when they digest food, they produce methane. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas. There are also other issues with cattle. But if you look at pork, if you look at chicken, you'll find that they have much smaller environmental footprints. But there's a whole contingent of people arguing that if you take cattle and you put them on pasture and pasture them in such a way that they actually sequester carbon in the pasture, they argue that cattle can be one of the most effective and environmentally friendly ways to raise meat if it's done correctly. So again, it is just endlessly, maddeningly complicated. But I essentially agree with Neil that the intense factory system that we have here in the United States is not going to work for the planet.
And Neil, looking at some of the research, there's a suggestion that pork or chicken's a better choice than broccoli, calorie for calorie. And if you'll allow me, let me quote Paul Fishbeck to you, a Carnegie Mellon University researcher, who said, eating lettuce is over 3 times worse in greenhouse gas emissions than eating bacon. Neil?
That's interesting. I think if you really start to pick at certain foods, it's very easy to make an argument that X food is better or worse than the other. I think about a few years ago when California's drought was the big news topic in America, and still continues to be a concern, there were a lot of news reports about why we shouldn't be attacking the dairy industry and its excessive, and the meat industry and its excessive water consumption. Instead, we should blame almonds because almonds require a gallon of water to produce 1 almond. I think if you break it down by foods, you'll find some argument to some sort of facts to suit your argument. But I think to address the issue of cows especially, we have to keep in mind cows and other farm animals consume a majority of the grains and the crops that we grow today. And this isn't a simple question about switching from one to the other or changing the diet of a cow and having them graze as a solution, because greenhouse gas emissions is just one aspect of the problem caused by animal agriculture.
Yeah, that's interesting.
We can't ignore deforestation, for example.
So greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation. Tamara, I mean, the almond thing's really interesting, and water, because I was in San Francisco in 2013. A colleague made me feel really bad for eating a handful of almonds because of the water issue there. So that wasn't meat, that was just almonds. When we talk about harm to the environment, how do we rate this on the scale of harm to the environment? So we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, we're talking about deforestation, as Neil mentioned it. What else are we talking about when we say the environment? Because a lot of people just think climate change in terms of global warming.
Well, the list is endless. And of course, one of the issues with factory farms is what they do with the manure. And on the one hand, we've seen all kinds of evidence that manure lagoons can pollute water sources, and that's a huge problem. On the other hand, we know that manure can also be used in methane digesters to produce energy. So it's so specific to the operation that it's very difficult to talk about this in generalities. And as you point out, there are all kinds of ways that things can harm the environment. It can be air pollution, it can be water pollution, it can be greenhouse gases. And, we haven't even talked about animal welfare, which is arguably another harm. And the idea that an individual consumer has to make a decision about a pork chop when she goes to the supermarket without having all of this information, I think puts this question in perspective. Because obviously we can't choose a diet that is the lowest in greenhouse gases, because nobody even agrees on what that is. And you can't have the information about this pork chop or that cabbage. But all we can do is try and be prudent. And I think that means that we do try and eat less meat. We try and eat more beans, for example, which are pretty much agreed upon to be a very climate-friendly food. And we try and make choices across the board that are a little better than the choices we made yesterday.
Okay, unfortunately, we are out of time. Tamar Haspel and Neil Zacharias, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.